Hello and welcome to Chapter 2. We've got some great examples of double exposures in Photoshop. Now this is such a wonderful technique. It really creates some stunning images, and it's a relatively simple technique as well. So I know by the end of this chapter you are going to become a double exposure master. We got a great first example. We're starting off really simple here, and we're just going to kind of ramp up and get a little bit more complicated. Well, alright, let's jump into Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop, and we're in our sample images, Chapter 2, double exposures, and we're in our first folder, woman and water. Now, if you haven't already downloaded your sample images, please do so. You can do that right on this tutorial page. So to start off with, let's go ahead and open up our two images here, woman and water 1 and 2.jpg. So let's just click and drag those right into Photoshop. There we go. Now, we are going to do a few examples of double exposure using color, but the majority are going to be black and white. And the reason is it's just a little bit easier to blend multiple exposures together when you're working in black and white. So let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to use our move tool. I'm going to hold shift and click and drag from this image to this image. And this is the idea. So we're going to start off with two different layers in the same image. Let's go ahead and close that down. I'm going to hit F for full screen to see what I can basically to fill my entire screen with my images. Now, if you hit Control or Command T, that's going to bring up your transform dialog, and you can see this water layer is actually quite a bit larger than the layer of my subject. So what I'm going to do is shrink that down. But before I shrink that down, I'm going to convert to a smart object, and the reason is that if I shrink this down and decide later I want to make it larger again, if I use a smart object, I won't lose any quality. If I don't use a smart object, we're going to see a loss of quality. So let's just hit escape. There we go. That gets out of the transform dialog. We're going to right click here, and we're going to go to convert to smart object. And you can see we have a smart object symbol right here on the bottom right of that thumbnail. So you can see if I hit Control or Command T, and let's say we were to transform this like way small. Okay, you can see it's tiny. If I hit Control or Command T again, you can just go up here and transform it. There we go. Let's type in 100% and 100%. There we go. And we're back to our original quality. So you can see I made it really small, and then I made it 1000% the width, and then back to our normal size. And we haven't lost any quality during that process. So we're going to be using a lot of smart objects for that reason. Well, the next thing we're going to do is create a black and white adjustment layer. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go to my adjustment layers. It's this white and dark little circle icon right over here. Okay, or you can go to layer, down to new adjustment layer, and over here to black and white. Either way. There we go. That's just going to give us a black and white adjustment layer. Alright, let's go ahead and close that down. So now getting into like the main part of blending different exposures. So when we're doing our exposure combination in Photoshop, we're simulating film. And basically how film works when you take multiple exposures is the exposures kind of like add to each other in terms of brightness. So one image lets a little bit of light into the camera, and another image lets a little bit more light into the camera. So for the most part, you're talking about light. So what we're going to be doing is using lighten blend modes for the majority of this tutorial, and we do have some special examples where we're going to be using darken blend modes as well. So let's go ahead and change our layer blend mode from normal down to lighten. And you can see when we do that, that the dark areas on this image just simply disappear. Okay, you can see right through the dark areas, and you can see to the light. Now in this case, we have a double exposure here. It already works. Now we do have the top of our image here, and you can see it's relatively light colored. If I bring it up here, it just kind of disappears on its own, okay, because it's set to lighten blend mode. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of, like you can see here, if I just click on this layer and hit Control or Command T, you can see my image actually extends, quite a bit past this boundary. So I can just kind of bring this in, and we can see all that information now on my image. There we go. Now if you don't want to see these little bounding boxes here, you can hit Control or Command H, and that's just going to hide those bounding boxes. Okay, so sometimes what I'll do is I'll grab this little guy and hit Control or Command H, and then you can still move it it can be a little bit like tough because you still have to click down here and move this little icon here. But if you hit Control or Command H, you can't see it, but you can still actually click and move it. Okay, so that might take a little bit of practice. Remember, just Control or Command H. If it's the first time you press this, it's going to ask if you want to hide Photoshop or hide the extras. Just choose hide the extras. Okay, so what I do is like I'll unhide this, get an idea of where it is, and then I'll go ahead and hide it, and then click and drag and then move this around. So this way I can kind of bring this exposure exactly, or, you know, 'cause in this case I don't want that covering up our subject's eye, right? So we're just going to bring it about to where I think it looks good, and that's the end of our transformation, and we're going to hit enter there. So there we go. I think that looks pretty good there. We have a couple more options. This is already looking great. Again, we're starting off with a simple double exposure. So we're using, for the most part, light and blend modes. We're going to use dark and blend modes as well. And our next option is to choose the light and dark areas of this image. We can use like a levels adjustment layer, for instance, to either lighten or darken this layer. And as I do that, it's going to change how it blends in with the background. So let's go ahead and show you how to do that. Because this layer is a smart object, instead of using an adjustment layer, which would be like layer, adjustments, and levels, okay? So you can see levels, there we go. This creates its own adjustment layer, okay? Now, normally I would use an adjustment layer, and the reason is because this is a non-destructive way of editing. However, if you have a smart object, you can just use a levels adjustment, different from a levels adjustment layer. I know it's almost the same thing, but I'll explain the difference. Because we have a smart object, this is also non-destructive. So you always want to be able to edit non-destructively, which basically means you want to be able to change your settings at any time. You don't ever want to apply something to an image and have it set forever. You can always go back and change when you work non-destructively. Okay, so there's two ways to work non-destructively when working with levels. The first way is to create a levels adjustment layer, like we have here. You can see it's its own layer. And the second way is if you're working on a smart object, and remember, smart objects will always have this little symbol here. Then you can just go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. So you can see we have almost the same options here, but this time, okay, you can see, I'm just going to hit OK here. This time, instead of applying it as a new layer, it applies this as a smart filter to our smart object. So that's another big benefit of using smart objects, that you could just apply a levels adjustment directly to that layer. For instance, we have our image here, our layer with the water, we have our smart filters, and we have levels. Now if I want to, I can double click on this levels adjustment layer, or this levels adjustment rather, and I can make my darks darker. Now what's happening in my image is my layer is starting to disappear. And the reason is because I have it set to a light and blend mode. So if I make my darks even darker, they're going to just start to disappear. You can also take your midpoints and make your midpoint either darker or lighter, and this will just simply have your layer either hide or show more or less. And you can do the same with your lights. You could have your lights even brighter, there we go, or darker. Now my main goal here when I'm doing this is to get these layers to blend together in a realistic way. Okay, so that's the majority of what I want everything to look natural. You know, if my image came in and it was this bright, then what I would do is I would simply make my lights a little bit darker. So you can make your lights darker by clicking and dragging from right to left here, and you can make your darks lighter by clicking and dragging from here. Okay, so it's very, very handy to use a levels adjustment. Now, I think this actually looks pretty good. We've just made it a little bit darker. There we go. That looks pretty good there. So let's hit OK. Now you can get back to this levels adjustment. See, I can turn this off and on. We have a slight change in our image. Because we're using a smart object, I can get back to this at any time. Just double click right here on the levels, and you can see I can change it. So like for instance, if I changed it like that, and I'm like, you know what, I want it more visible, we can just double click right here again, okay, and kind of bring it back to where it is. This is a non-destructive way of editing. Okay, so that's one way if you use a smart object. The next way is to use a levels adjustment layer. So we're going to show you both throughout this tutorial. Just as long as you're editing non-destructively, that's the main goal. Okay, now we don't need this layer, so let's go ahead and delete it. We can just click here and drag down. Now this layer, it does look really good. There's just one area. I don't really want this part to be visible, where it's right over my subject's lips. So we're going to create a layer mask, and this just allows us to hide or show areas of our image. Now, a white layer mask means it's totally visible. Black layer mask means it's totally invisible. So what we're going to do is just paint black right over that area. So let's just grab our brush tool and hit B for the brush tool. Okay, I'm going to make sure that black is my foreground color here, and we're just going to paint with a little bit of black right here on my image. Just make sure your brush mode is set to normal. There we go. So we're just going to paint black right there, just a little bit, which simply hides the layer wherever I paint black. So, for instance, I could paint black over, half of it, and it would be gone there. You can simply paint white, and it will show up again. There we go. Let's just paint black right there, and we are good to go. So now you can see, you can turn this off or on, the black and white adjustment layer. And because we started with this black and white image, we throw this blue on there, and this doesn't really look that great as a double exposure. I mean, it looks okay, and you could definitely have this as a look, but in this case, we're just going to do black and white, and you can see everything blends together really well. Now, we can do one more thing that I'm going to show you here, and this is using a gradient map to actually color your image. So let's say we turn off the black and white adjustment layer. Okay, we're going to go to Layer, down to New Adjustment Layer, and over to Gradient Map. Let's hit OK. Now, gradient maps are they're wonderful. I love gradient maps. Basically, how gradient map works is when you go to your property windows on a gradient map, you can click on your gradient. Now, there are a few gradients that come loaded with Photoshop already. For instance, we have this purple to orange, and red to green, and we have a few different gradients here that are loaded up. Now, the reason I love gradient maps is because you can actually map the dark colors to the light colors of your image. So in this case, what's happening is my dark colors are red and my light colors are green. I can change that. If I just click on this red color, I can say, you know what, my dark colors, I just want to be like a really dark blue. Okay? My light colors, maybe I want these to be like a really kind of light but desaturated yellow. There we go. And then somewhere in between here, I'd like to throw in a little bit more color here. So we get maybe like a nice blue. Alright, that looks good. And then maybe right up here, we'll see maybe this is going to be like a bright red. There we go. Maybe it's a little bit less saturated. Alright. There we go. Now you can move these to the left and the right as well if you'd like. There we are. Okay. Now if you want to delete them, you just click and drag straight down, and that'll delete it. Okay. I'm going to hit Control or Command Z to undo. There we go. And hit OK there. So you can see, you can basically color your image, and what's nice about this, let's hit OK there, you can color your image, and this affects everything that's underneath it. So we started out with a black and white, now I can turn this gradient map on and just color my black and white, and because I throw this other layer on there, you can see it's being colored with the exact same color as well. So you can go with a black and white variation of double exposure if you'd like. The other great variation is to do a gradient map variation, which will color every single layer under it. Well, that's it for our first example using double exposure. So we went over a lot of the basics here. We went kind of slow just to make sure you guys are like, okay, good, we're on the same page. Now we're going to just continue to move on. We'll get more and more complicated with our double exposures. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next video.